Our next storyteller, his vision is connecting stories and people. After attending the Sounds of the Mountains Storytelling Festival, he became interested in storytelling. In 2018, he produced his first Telebration event and started his business, Storytelling Connections. While this is his first appearance as a Hoot and Holler storyteller, he is a regular teller at Blue Ridge Story Space up in Floyd, which is a super cool event if you're ever up there, and hosts Let Me Tell Ya storytelling events. He believes our lives are full of stories and that stories connect our lives. Please welcome first-time Hoot and Holler storyteller, Clinton Atwater.
Good evening. Can we just say thank you to every veteran that is in the house tonight? Thank you for your service. Tonight I'm going to be sharing a story of a very special veteran in my life, someone that I have the deepest respect and admiration for. My father-in-law, Joe. Now, Joe was a stoic man, but he loved to garden. My mother-in-law, Patty, she loved to laugh, and she loved to cook. Now, in my mind, that combination of gardening and cooking was just fine by me because I love to eat. Now, Joe wasn't my wife's biological father, but he was her papa. And that's what all of us called him, was Papa Joe. Now, Papa Joe was born in 1925. He was 20 years Patty's senior. He was born in a small town in rural Pennsylvania. As a young boy, he watched as his mother was taken off to a TB sanitarium, leaving him to be raised by his older sister, older brother, and their alcoholic father. Joe didn't talk a lot about his childhood, but I remember he shared one story with me. He told me, he says, Clint, one morning I woke up and, the pain in my stomach. He said, I got up quietly. I didn't want to wake my dad. Didn't know what kind of mood he would be in, but he snuck out of the house. It was still dark. Dawn was just about to break. He started wandering the streets of his hometown, trying to find a garden that he could get into to try to find something to eat. He told me, he said, Clint, it wasn't stealing, it was surviving. Fast forward several years, and Joe's returning from World War II. Decided to move to Detroit, where he would find a job and start his life. It was in the suburbs of Detroit that he bought his first home. Well, in truth, it was the only home that Joe ever owned. It was in that home that he raised 3 children, that he lost his first wife to cancer. It was in that home that Patty and Joe lived. It was a small but modest home, but Joe took great pride in it. But what Joe really took pride in was the garden in the backyard. Now, this garden took up half of his small suburban backyard. But it was his pride and joy. My parents had gardened some when I was young, and my parents, they grew the most amazing weeds. But Joe grew the juiciest tomatoes, the sweetest peas, and the tangiest peppers. My mouth's watering just thinking about them now. He told me, he said, Clint, the secret to gardening is the compost. You see, Joe had a compost pile, or a compost bin in the back of his garden. He said that's where he put all of his grass clippings. He'd scrape his table scraps in there, coffee grounds. Went through a lot of coffee grounds in that compost pile. He says, the secret is that garbage goes in, but the richest compost comes out. Joe loved his garden. That's where he was at peace. If the sun was shining, Joe was outdoors in his garden. 2009, my wife and myself and our kids, we moved to Roanoke from Michigan as a result of the Great Recession. Mom and Joe, they came down to visit us on several occasions. But as Joe was getting older, he was getting a little bit more forgetful. Dementia was starting to set in. And being in strange surroundings was proving to be more and more challenging. So we knew that it was going to be the last trip that they'd be making down. It was just getting too difficult to travel. And so my wife says, hey, we ought to go to the D-Day Memorial. Now, I'm a veteran and I'm excited about this. I've taken several people to the D-Day Memorial. And I'm like, yeah, let's go. And she says, well, by we, I mean you should take Joe alone. Now, I enjoyed spending time with Joe, and we did often. But in truth, my wife and Patty were there, and they served as a buffer in case the conversation lulled a little bit. But I reluctantly said, okay, we'll go. Next day, got up, headed to the D-Day Memorial, got there shortly after it opened up. The whole time I'm thinking, what am I going to talk about? What am I going to say? And more importantly, how is Joe going to handle the emotional stress of being at a war memorial celebrating D-Day, knowing that he had served in World War II? So we got there, and I said to Joe, well, Joe, would you like to do the guided tour, or would you prefer to just walk around, just the two of us? He looked at me and he says, I think I prefer just the two of us. In my mind, I'm going, oh. I was really hoping for the guided tour, for someone to help carry the conversation. Now, I wasn't really sure how Joe was going to do at the memorial, so we decided to start in the gardens. I knew that the gardens would be a good place to start. So as we're walking around the gardens, he opens up and he says, well, Clint, you know that my brother died in World War II, and I probably had known that, but hadn't remembered it. And so he told me that Stevie, his older brother, had landed in Normandy just a couple of weeks after D-Day. And I said, okay. And I said, well, Joe, when did you arrive? He said, well, I was a few months later. And so he arrived in country, and it was only a month or so after he arrived in country that he found out that his brother had passed away fighting a battle in Belgium. And so with that news, he earned himself a trip home as the only male son. And he told me about riding that trip home aboard the Queen Elizabeth II, that long boat ride, thinking about his brother, not really sure where his life was going to go. Now, not all of the time that we spent in the memorial was quiet and somber. There were moments that Joe really lit up. One of those was when we were walking around and looking at the flags for the Allied forces, and we got to Czechoslovakia. Joe was of Czechoslovakian heritage, and he looked at me, and he looked at me with pride, and he says, we were a small country, but we sacrificed just the same. And so I knew that Joe was really proud of that. We carried on, and there were many, many moments of somber silence as I would look into his eyes, and I could see that he was remembering as the tears would well up in those nearly blind eyes. After a few hours, I asked Joe if he was ready to go home, and he says, yeah, let's head home. So we headed home. I had the deepest respect for Joe. And as a veteran from the National Guard, I knew the cost of wearing the uniform. I wore that uniform with pride. But it was that day, walking around the memorial, that I fully understood the cost of freedom. Patty passed away in 2017 after a 4-year battle with cancer. And Joe had lost his second wife. With his advanced age, onset of dementia, he went to live with his oldest daughter. Joe passed away 15 months later, just 10 days shy of his 93rd birthday. I have the utmost respect and deepest appreciation for Joe and what he taught me that day in the memorial. When I think about what I would like my grandchildren to call me, I smile and I say, "You can call me Papa." Thank you very much.